Welcome to Unit 2, Section 3, Greek Philosophy. In this section of notes, we're going to be talking about specifically the glory that was Greece and how Greece is one of the most influential, probably the most influential civilization to the Western Hemisphere. And that's why we spend so much time talking about them and just really reviewing what they had to say and what they believe. So in this section of notes, we're going to be talking about some of the great Greek philosophers, some poetry, some architecture, and just writing in general. So again, in your notes, you should be writing at the very top of your page, wherever you're taking notes, Unit 2, Section 3, Greek Philosophy. I love this painting right here. This is from Raphael. It is in Rome. It's at the Vatican. When I came to this room and I saw this painting, it is absolutely beautiful. Now, this would be the School of Athens. And here at the center, you have two of the greatest philosophers of all time, Plato with his hand up and Aristotle with his hand forward. We can talk a little bit more about what that means in class, but this is such an important painting that Raphael did because it depicts what these philosophers were doing and what they thought at this school. This school would have been a very open place. Students would have come at all different ages, whenever they wanted, and would have left whenever they wanted. They would have learned knowledge, then they would have gone out into the world and practiced what they learned, and then come back for more knowledge. It is the ideal school that a teacher and a student would want to be at. And so we're going to be talking about what Athens did to make such a great education system and what they did to have so many great thinkers come. Because really, we call this the Holy Trinity of philosophy. You have Socrates, you have Plato, both Athenians themselves. And while Aristotle is not an Athenian, he did most of his work in Athens. And why do these three men have such a huge grip on the philosophical world? And so we'll be talking a lot about them today. So here's our objectives. Focus question stays the same. How do I analyze information and make it my own opinion? I really hope you guys see the importance of this skill. There's so much misinformation out there that it's very important that we look at credible information, that we take all the different things that we hear and read about, and that we bring them together, synthesize them, and make our own opinions. So hopefully we're doing that. In objective one, what did most Athenians go to school for? So what was their purpose in going to school, and what was the actual, like, today we might say most people go to school to become doctors, or most people go to school to have business. Like business, if you go to a university, a lot of people major in business. So what was like the big major, if you want to call it that, in the Athenian time period? Objective two, who are the great philosophers of Athens? There's going to be several. We're going to be talking about the three great ones, so I've already kind of given you the answer for that. But we'll talk about other philosophers as well. Objective three, how did the Greek excel in architecture? The Greeks made some of the most memorable, most amazing buildings. The Romans really copied a lot of their architecture from the Greeks. And today we even use Greco-Roman kind of architecture in our own architecture today. Nobody goes to Washington, D.C. and doesn't see Greek architecture everywhere. So when we go on American Heritage, you'll see a lot of that kind of, architecture as you go. It's classical architecture that's still really popular today. Objective four, why was poetry so important to the Greeks? We'll talk about poems, poetry, how they used poetry, and what its purpose was. And then objective five, who is the father of history? Okay, we're going to be talking about specifically one man who was one of the most revolutionary when it came to history. Okay, so those are our objectives. Go ahead and pause that if you need to, but those are our 5 objectives for this unit. So let's talk about Greek philosophers. First, you should understand this. The Greeks had this confidence in the power of the human mind. Remember, Greeks thought the human body was one of the most perfect, beautiful things in the world. And the idea is that there is this eternal truth out there, and that your brain, the human brain, can comprehend it. So if you look here, one of our great philosophers, Plato, he's pointing up. And the reason he is pointing up is he's saying everything we're experiencing here on earth is a shadow. Everything we're experiencing here on earth is a representation of something perfect. So we say things like circle, we say things like square, we say things like beauty, or any of those things, and we are looking at shadows of something that we've never truly experienced completely. Yes, we see somebody that's beautiful. Yes, we see something that is beautiful in nature, but we are only seeing a representation of something that is truly perfect in beauty, truly perfect in square, or perfect in roundness. And this is going to be Plato's point of mind. And so the Greeks are trying to comprehend that with their own brains, okay? Greek thinkers, artists, and writers, they explored their universe, the nature that they had, and the people in it. And they did this through a lot of different ways of reasoning, which we'll get into. Some Greek thinkers, that they were called lovers of wisdom, used their observation and reason to decide and to describe what was going on in the world around them. So this is really the beginning of science. They are looking at nature, they're looking at things that are happening, and they're trying to determine why those things are happening. Now, is it as structured as how we see science today? No. But it is definitely a first attempts at people trying to understand the world around them by using observation. A lot of these Greek philosophers looked at things like mathematics and music, and they used what they called logic in order to understand this. Meaning, they started to see that mathematics is really in every aspect of our lives, whether it be building. That's pretty clear, right? Building has a lot of mathematics in it. But they also realized that music is full of mathematics. In fact, some of the great philosophers and ideas of the Greeks, like Pythagoras, right, who came up with the Pythagorean theorem, believed that the whole universe was actually making a buzzing noise, a musical noise that was perfectly mathematical, and that idea is still out there today. So a lot of this is trying to be understood through a logical, rational way. So instead of looking at something and saying that's magic or that's something that we, whatever, it's there's a way to explain it. We may not know it yet, but through rational thinking, we can understand all things. Okay? They also tried to look at ethical issues. There was this obvious idea that, like, in the world, sometimes there are really easy things, like, if somebody is harming somebody else, we should step in and stop that fight, that harm. There are other things that are less obvious, like if I have to kill one person to save 10 people, is it ethical to do that, or is it more ethical to let the one person live and the 10 people to die? Like, what's more ethical in that, right? So they looked at things like that in studying human behavior. In Athens specifically, this is going to be a really big issue, and there's going to be a group of philosophers called sophists. Now, you should definitely know about the sophists. They went about looking for these ideas, and really they're going to be called what we call moral relativists, meaning they are going to think that really right and wrong is more something that is a conceptual idea in your head. There's really not right and wrong in the world. There's just what you think is right and wrong in your head, and you should be true to yourself and live what you think is right and wrong. Well, they also started to practice a skill called rhetoric. Now, this is what the Greeks, this is the answer to our first objective, this is what the Greeks went into with their studies, is rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art of skillfully persuading people or speaking to people. So it's like taking your speaking class, basically. And the idea here is this: there's these really complicated ideas, and you should investigate those ideas, and you should then try to persuade people to the way you're thinking, or they should persuade you to the way they're thinking. But either way, truth is going to come out through skillful, persuasive speaking. So this rhetoric is the number one skill that people are going to be practicing. Okay? There's a lot of turmoil from the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was the fight the Athenians had with the Spartans, or not, yeah, with the Spartans. And so because of this war, they are going to be fighting a lot. This is going to lead a lot of Athenians to becoming sophists, the idea of really trying to look at things themselves and follow what they believe to be true, rather than somebody saying this is true. We should determine it ourselves. So from the sophists comes this probably perhaps the greatest philosopher of all time. His name is Socrates. We kind of look at him as almost the father of philosophy, although many people would argue with that. He is definitely one of the great philosophers of all time. This is part of one of your objectives as well, isn't it? He was this outspoken critic of the sophists. Now, it's important to realize this. He kind of comes out of the sophists, like he's almost like a sophist at first, but then he changes kind of his perspective in his mind. And the idea is this: where the sophists are saying there's really not truth out there, there's really just what people are doing, what they believe is right and wrong in their own mind. Socrates is going to say, no, there is eternal truth. There is something out there that is right and wrong, and we need to understand it. Just because we don't understand it now doesn't mean we can't understand it, okay? Now, the problem is that Socrates went around with his rhetoric, or his rhetorical skills. And as he went about, he never wrote down what he said. He just went literally. In fact, the accounts say that he was really kind of a haggard looking guy. He didn't have nice clothes. He was not the most well kept looking guy. And that he literally went around and just spoke with people and had deep conversations. And he practiced what we now call the Socratic method. He always played devil's advocate. He asked many questions. He explored lots of different areas. Just so that he could find the truth of things. So, this idea of playing devil's advocate or having two opposing sides that fight until the truth comes out, this is a Socratic method. Now, luckily, we have his ideas from his student. Now, many people were what we call disciples of Socrates. He had a whole group of guys who followed Socrates around, maybe not night and day, but they went and they listened to him, they lectured with him, they asked him questions, they interacted with him. And his probably most important student, or perhaps the most devoted student, was Plato. Plato is his name. Yeah, I know it sounds funny, right? Plato, like Plato that you play with, but Plato is this man who is a student of his, and he writes down the things that Socrates says, and from that we get a lot of our knowledge about Socrates. Now, this is a problem in and of itself. How do we know what Socrates said? How do we know that what Plato is writing down is actually what Socrates thought? Right? Anytime you have somebody that's writing what somebody else is thinking, you have this problem of it's through the lens of that person. So is this really Plato or is this Socrates? Right? What we do know is that the Socratic method comes from Socrates. He would pose a series of questions to students, and then he would challenge them and examine the implications. Now, he wasn't that like annoying person who would never concede. In fact, oftentimes Socrates would pose these questions and then he would change his mind as they went through the conversation. He didn't believe that there was anything important about holding to one viewpoint or the other. He really wanted to just find out what was truth, but he challenged a lot of the status quo. If there was this status quo, or if there was this rule, or there was this law, he would say, is that really a good law? Is that really a good rule? And he would poke holes into it, thinking that if it really was, it would be able to withstand the questions that he asked. Because of this, he really starts to challenge Greek authority. He starts saying, is our society and democracy really actually good, or is this just a system we're using that's really not good? And he's actually going to be teaching the youth, the young men in Athens, to start really questioning this. This is obviously a problem if you're a government. If you have, just like think about it, if you're a teacher and constantly your students are questioning your rules and your laws and everything like that, the problem is that you might have people start trying to overthrow you, or might people have that disagree with you. Socrates is teaching these young kids that this is good, that they should question things, that they shouldn't just blindly obey what people have put into their system, or put in their government and law. Because of this, the government is going to sentence Plato. They're going to have a big trial, and they're going to sentence him either to exile or to death. Okay. This is his fellow Athenians, but they all believe, this jury, you can call them, they all believe that he has been poisoning the youth's minds and that he's not safe for society. So he either has to leave, which in and of itself is really a death sentence because there's really not much out there, or he can drink some hemlock, which is a poison, and he can kill himself. Well, Socrates is going to do the latter, which surprises many people, right? So here's this artist depiction of the death of Socrates. It was painted in 1787, and it was by Jacques Louis David. And this painting really represents Socrates and his belief. Now, notice this painting here, and remember it when we get to this one about Plato at the very first slide. What do they both have in common? Their hands are up. They're both pointing up. Plato was a definitely devoted student to Socrates. Now, these people around him are all of his students. And the story goes, is that they are weeping. They are so sad to have somebody like Socrates go. Now, in this depiction of him, he looks like a strong, muscular man and this nice clean white robe, but in reality it's probably not so much. The most accounts we see, he's kind of dingy, he's dirty, he's not the most he doesn't really value those things. He values just learning truth. His whole quest in life is basically find truth out. So they're all weeping. Now, the story goes is that Socrates stops them and he says, why are you weeping? In fact, he says, I feel bad for you guys. You're the ones that have to sit and live with these idiots that just put me to death. I go the way of eternal truth. And he's pointing up. Now, it's not necessarily to God, it's not necessarily to heaven. We know that Socrates was somewhat critical of these things, although it looks like he did believe in it to some degree. But he does believe that there is this eternal truth out there, and he is excited that he gets to go and experience that now. So while these guys weep, he's going to drink the hemlock and he will die. It is the sad thing of Socrates. And this is where we kind of get a distrust of democracy, is how could a group of people believe that Socrates was evil enough that he had to be put to death? And the problem is that this is the problem with democracy. If you can convince people, enough people, bad things sometimes can happen under these systems. From Socrates comes, like I said, his most devoted student. His name is Plato. Plato fled Athens for 10 years because it wasn't really safe for him. I mean, here's Socrates, he dies, then, everybody's kind of watching Plato and these other disciples of Socrates with a pretty sharp, magnifying glass over them. Their actions are very criticized. So he flees from Athens, probably goes, I'm not sure, to a different city state and lives for 10 years. While he's gone, he will return and then he's going to set up a school. And the school is called the Academy. So the Academy is a really cool school. It's very different from what you and me think of. Plato emphasizes really one thing, and that's the importance of being reasonable and rational. There's no set necessarily curriculum. There isn't set like school schedules, like bells and classes and stuff. It's really about coming, learning, then leaving and practicing what you've learned, and then coming back when you need to. So it was like just coming and going frequently, lots and lots of different people, and all throughout their lives, not just, at a certain age group. From this, he's going to write his book called The Republic. This is where he describes a lot of Socrates' ideas, as well as he gives some of his own ideas. And in The Republic, he's going to give his version of what we call the ideal state, meaning the perfect country, the country that isn't going to have things like Socrates' death because people don't like him. He argues that states should regulate every aspect of citizens' lives. So, as far as Americans goes, we don't necessarily love this idea, right? He's going to say that the government should regulate what everybody does at all times. Now, his point is this. He's going to say, but the people in charge can't be just anyone. It can't be a democracy, can't be a king, can't just be anybody. It should be people like him, philosophers, people who love knowledge, people who their whole purpose in life is just to find truth. And he says if you can get those people in charge, they can regulate every person's life and they will always find the best interests of people. He's going to divide the state into these different classes: workers who need to work in order to produce the necessities of life, soldiers who need to defend the state, and philosophers who will rule the state. He is definitely believes in a hierarchy. He thinks the philosophers are contributing more than the workers, although the workers are very important. And he'll say we have their best interest because if the workers aren't doing well, we don't get fed. But he's ultimately going to think that the workers are not going to be intelligent enough or skilled enough to find out truth, and that really they're not to be trusted. So from Plato, he's going to believe that men were surpassing women in both mental and physical tasks. He believes that women are not really, by and large, the whole group of them, not as talented as men. Now, he will say that there are some notable exceptions. He'll say there are some women who can surpass men, but for the most part, on whole, men are more superior than women. From Plato comes his most famous student. So you had Socrates, his most notable student was Plato. Plato's most notable student is Aristotle. And Aristotle could be the most famous philosopher of all time. He is by far one of the most commonly sought, most commonly quoted. In fact, in a lot of books, they will say, the philosopher said this. When they say that, they're saying Aristotle. And it's really unique that Aristotle got this name simply because Aristotle disagreed a lot with his own teacher, Plato and Socrates. He develops his own ideas about government and what it should look like, and his own ideas about the world around him. He's going to be very suspicious, just like Plato, of democracy. He is not an Athenian, actually, by choice. He's a Macedonian who comes from Macedonia to Athens and is at the academy, and he lives between the two places. He does support the rule of a very strong and virtuous leader. This leader, he believes, could be a philosopher, but doesn't necessarily need to be one. But they need to be virtuous as far as they need to be good people. He believed that good contact meant that they would be in their life trying to find a golden mean or a moderation, like the golden rule, right? Between two extremes. Like you can't have people who are completely over to this side and you can't have people that are completely over to this side. It needs a good balance. And he promoted this reasoning for his way of learning. So this is all things he got from Plato, but he's going to have some major divergences as well from him, okay? Now, one of those major divergences is that Aristotle is going to believe Plato doesn't think completely that we can understand those perfect things in their entirety at all times unless you use really good reasoning. But he does believe those things are out there. Where Aristotle believes in much more of a scientific way, he says, no, you don't experience these things through just thinking really hard about them. You experience truth by making tests, watching those tests, and then taking the data that you get from the tests, the observations, and then conducting, you know, some rational explanations about what happened. So this sounds a lot like science, and that's because it is. He's really one that can be credited with almost inventing the scientific method, although he sometimes doesn't get the credit for that, because he does believe in advancing a study, advancing some kind of an experiment, watching it happen, and then giving observation and rationale of what did happen. So he really is the father of science that way, although a lot of his thoughts would definitely be contrary, right, to what we believe in science today. He had a very unique belief in the elements and the different elements that there were and how they worked, why fire and water and solids and everything like that, how they interacted with one another. He had a very interesting viewpoint on that. So let's talk a little bit about art and architecture. There's the end of our philosophers. So really you had the sophists, you had Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and that's going to be the answer to that question there. Now Plato is going to argue that every object on earth has an actual ideal form, meaning when you and me see round or circle, we are seeing something that is a part or a shadow, and I keep saying shadow and it'll make more sense when we get to the allegory of the cave. He's going to say we see a shadow of something that is actually there, a real thing. So he's going to convey this thought through perfect balance, and he's going to reflect that this harmony in the universe needs to have this balance, and that has how all things balance and work together. There's a balance between these different objects. Some of the best examples of this perfect balance is the Parthenon. This is the building right here, this great building built to the gods, right? Zeus would have had a big statue here in the middle. This unfortunately got partially blown up because of some bombs that were being stored there. And the different temples that were dedicated to the different gods. And this is really some of the greatest architecture that we have of the Greeks. It shows how advanced they were. It shows their level of strength and their understanding. We also have these great statues. Here's a discus thrower, right? So he's getting ready to throw a discus. Look at the anatomy of the body here. We're starting to see that people are getting very good with anatomy. Look at this man here, right? Here, I don't even know what's going on exactly, but here he is, his arm stretched out. And again, look at the anatomy. So we see a lot of studying of the body. The Greeks, again, really thought the body was just this perfect representation. See a lot of Greek clay pots and everything like that with different artist depictions of different events. And the Greek sculptors and painters was like they tried to take what they were doing, and they said these are symbols of something that's a perfect thing. So again, this discus is circular, and we can see how circular it is. We can see this body and its proportionality, how it's split in the middle, and how things are symmetrical. And these things look good to us. They're pleasing to us because ultimately these ideas of symmetry are eternally true, things that we don't quite understand here on this earth. So here's the Supreme Court Justice. This is the highest court in all the land. This is in Washington, D.C. When we go, you can walk up these steps and you can see these great Corinth columns that are Greek. It's so clear, right? Look at this. Look familiar? I mean, right? That we're using Greek architecture to really try to show strength. I mean, when you look at this building, what does this suggest about our government? suggests a country of fairness, a country of intelligence, a country of industry, a country of power, right? You don't make these beautiful columns without great understanding and intelligence and education. You don't have these buildings. These promote learning and ideas. This is Greek architecture, right? So this is just one building out of many that you would see in Washington D.C. And it's one of my favorite buildings, not just because the Supreme Court's there, but because the building itself is just a really cool building. So let's talk a little bit about these different types of architecture. If you look here, right, they had these different types of terraces. They had these different columns. They had the different styles that they have, and they had different orders. You had this Doric order and the Ionic order, and they you can go up to a building and you can really see which one they're practicing based on the steps, the columns, the building and the terraces themselves. All of them are really symbolic of a certain order, and these people would have been in competition with one another trying to build more buildings. I personally like the Ionic order more. I think their columns are cooler looking and are more prestigious. So this architecture, whatever order it was supposed to represent a perfect balance and harmony and unity, right? And so the mathematical skills and how things were symmetrical perfectly was really important to the Greeks themselves. Greek columns, the Ionic and Doric, we just showed you that and the difference there, so I don't think we need to spend much time, but these are the different things they have. Let's talk a little bit about poetry and drama. You guys should all recognize this guy. Here's Homer, right? And Homer is the great orator of the different poetry from back then. Here we have the different play masks. We have the happy. You have the sad, and we'll talk about that some more here. Greek literature really is going to begin with these epics from Homer. Homer is the greatest Greek writer we could probably point to. There are many, many Greek writers. There's Sophocles, there's Ovid, there's all sorts, but Homer is probably the most famous. Later, we're going to have Sappho and Pindar, and we're going to have a whole bunch of others, but Homer really takes the cake as far as who's the most important one. The most important aspect of literature that the Greeks are going to give is going to be in the field of drama. They had great plays, really important plays that are going to be very iconic and very famous. The first Greek plays evolved out of like these religious festivals from the Dionysius days. Dionysius was a god of pleasure and of wine and things like that. So they would have had these great time periods of drinking a lot and having a lot of interactions with each other, and they would have had a lot of different plays to help them teach and learn about things more. The plays are meant as almost an allegory. So you're looking at an allegory of a play, and it's supposed to be teaching you a much deeper meaning, something that is supposed to resonate with you and make you come closer to truth. A lot of the plays were tragedies. These tragedies are when they're going to tell the stories of humans that are suffering, that are going through some really hard disaster. Some of these could be like Sophocles wrote a play called Oedipus, and in Oedipus, he is as a small boy kicked out of the kingdom and is actually left to be eaten, devoured by wolves, because there's a prophecy that he is going to have inappropriate relations with his mother and kill his father. He doesn't know this necessarily, but he's kicked out of the kingdom, and then as the story goes, right, some tragic things befall him and horrible things happen. This is supposed to represent our lives and how difficult they can be and how hard it can be sometimes for us to get through the things that we need to get through. The purpose of the tragedy was to stir people to their emotions, to pity and to fear, to try to reinforce ideas, to try to help people question ideas, to help people look at their own lives and see how they can get through these tragedies. These were great plays, and some of the greatest classics come from Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus. These plays would have been done at a theater like this. Here, this looks kind of like an auditorium, right? And our auditoriums are generally based off of the Greek plays. And so, as we look at this, this is a obviously redone auditorium or amphitheater that was used to have plays played here at the center so people could learn and understand. The idea is that more people can fit in here. The acoustics of it, you can hear people from down here clear up here. It was a great place to go and learn great things. So one of the things, the opposite of a tragedy is a comedy. Comedies are oftentimes seen as humorous plays, and they mocked people or their customs and things like that, and that is a comedy. But however, a comedy is also is different from a tragedy, not just because it's funny, but it's also called a comedy because in the end, everything's made right. Where a tragedy, Oedipus Rex, spoiler alert, is going to fulfill the prophecy that he was trying to never have to fulfill. He'll kill his father, have inappropriate relations with his mother, he'll cut out his eyes, and he'll wander around begging the rest of his life, right? It's not the good ending. It's not an ending you want to hear. Where, on the other hand, we have plays like we have plays that are comedies not only because they're being funny, but because they are, at the end of the day, they are correct. So a good example is Midsummer Night's Dream from Shakespeare, where in the end, the lovers who love each other, instead of like tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, where they both die and nobody's happy, in the comedy, they find their love, they're happy, they end together, they're happy. So if you ever come to a play and it's called a comedy, you have kind of an idea that the ending is going to be a good ending. It may be there might be some plot twists where you didn't realize something was going to happen, but in the end, they're going to be happy, and everything's going to be made right. So here's our last section of writing. This is our last. We with our drama, we just answered our other objective. Now we're going to get into our very last objective. Who was the first historian, if you want to call him that? Okay, and this is debatable, but the Greeks applied this observation and reasoning not only to things like philosophy and science and things like that, they also applied it to the study of history. They're the first ones that start to really try to keep accurate, detailed accounts of what's going on in civilization. Not just Homer's, like where he's trying to make people interested and excited. We don't call Homer a historian because he's talking about Cyclops and he's embellishing and he's lying about things. He's not trying to keep what Homer's doing is not trying to keep accurate historical data. He's trying to make people interested in a story. It's like Hollywood doing the Titanic. Yes, are there components that are true? Yes. But at the end of the day, was there a guy named Jack who ends up being frozen because the lady won't help move over on the board she's on and let him live? No, right? That's just an embellishment made by Hollywood so that you go and watch the movie and enjoy that, right? Homer's that way. Another person that we're going to be talking about is a man named Herodotus. Herodotus we call the father of history because that is what he's trying to do. He is trying to take historical records from Homer and he's trying to look at them correctly. One of the things that he'll do is look at the Persian Wars, which we'll get into the next section of notes, and he's trying to understand what's going on and how these things are working. His writings do reflect his own bias, though, and every historian really, if they're being truthful to you, has bias, and that you can't escape it. Nobody writes and nobody talks without their own viewpoints, their own paradigms. They may try to take that bias out as much as possible, but in the end, you're going to have biases as part of your writing. Uh, Thucydides, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his name, wrote about the Peloponnesian War, which was between Athens and Sparta, right? And a great deal. So did Herodotus. You guys are going to be reading about his account of that. And well, you'll be reading, I guess, more about the Trojan War, but you'll be looking at these historical accounts, and you'll see the difference between him and Homer. Now, both these writers set these standards for future historians. So the very first historians that we look at are Herodotus and this Thucydides, okay? And they really do demonstrate people trying to keep accurate, authentic records for the first time. Okay, so that is our notes right there. And let's just go back and make sure we've reviewed all of our objectives so that way you have the answers. What did most Athenians go to school for? The answer was rhetoric, right? They're going to try to learn how to speak persuasively to each other. Objective 2, what are the great philosophers of Athens? We started with the Sophists really was the first group. Then we had Socrates, then we had Plato, and then we had Aristotle. So those are the great philosophers of Athens. Objective 3, how did the Greeks excel in architecture? They tried to use perfect balance, right? We talked about the balance that they used, the different types of architecture that they used, how this influenced and shaped their world, but it represented their viewpoint, right? Rational, harmonious, perfect balance. And this is going to be how they excel in architecture. Why was poetry so important to the Greeks? Because poetry taught them significant lessons, right? You had the tragedies, which helped them understand more of the the hardships, the struggles, and the difficulties of life that people had to face every day, gave them empathy, gave them understanding. You also have the comedies, which taught them about the way that things could work and how things could be balanced together and how things can be kind of funny if we just look at it in a different way and poke a hole in it, you know? And then our last one, who's the father of history? We're going to give that title to Herodotus. I think that you should also make a little honorable mention to Thucydides, which I know I'm mispronouncing, okay? And you can kind of give an idea of these are the biggest aspects of historical writing at the time period. Those are the answers to our objectives. Hope you learned a lot. Greek philosophy is fantastic and it's really interesting. Can't wait to talk to you guys more about that in class.